The road to hay and the journey beyond. Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table. Let us go through certain half-deserted streets, the muttering retreats of restless nights in one-night cheap hotels and sawdust restaurants with oyster-shells, streets that follow like a tedious argument of insidious intent to lead you to an overwhelming question. Oh, do not ask, what is it? Let us go and make our visit. I love T S Eliot. Prufrock, his journey, confession, realisation is where modern poetry started for me. I started writing poetry on the 3rd January 2019. I wrote in little notebooks for years, not poetry but character sketches and even stories, and a few first chapters of novellas. The now dusty and sun-baked old notebooks go back a decade. They sit on my desk. Poetry is a different ballgame though. I always read a lot of poetry but wrote little to nothing except one poem even before those old notebooks had existed. It did nothing for me, and I felt no compulsion to write poetry again. In my late teens and the early 20s, I went through a phase of reading almost whatever I could find at the Cardiff University's Arts and Social Sciences Library and Central Library in Cardiff's bookshelves. I read mostly modern poets, 20th century greats, and the odd tome from earlier. I bought a lot of Charles Bukowski book and read avidly Bukowski every day. He had sort of taken hold of me, and for a good few years I found it difficult to shake off his lifestyle poetry. The slightly mocking tone was just too difficult to shake off. Modern literary poetry has sometimes been confusing for me and took more effort to appreciate. Bukowski and the few others who wrote more directly, there was something accessible about their verse, and they spoke to me with a sense that required little processing. They were simple stories. In 2007, I walked into a Blackwell's bookshop and found myself stood by the poetry shelf, as I would check normally to see if there would be any more posthumously published editions of Bukowski of previously unpublished material. The latter is quite a distance from E, but a gleaming white slim volume of Prufrock and other poems was literally staring at me. I had spent a near decade within the university system, but all that had been in philosophy, aesthetics, ancient history, history of religion. My formal gaze at literature had stopped at the age of 16, so I missed out on Prufrock, which used to be my friend Jawad's reading list when we were at sixth form studying for A-levels, and I was busy with the sciences and him struggling with T S Eliot and others. I bought this volume, took it home and just fell in love. For the next dozen years I went through life living Eliot's words. I am no prophet and here is no great matter. I have seen the moment of my greatness flicker. And finally, on a bitterly cold January morning this year, I started writing verse. My poems are my stories of other stories that happened, are yet to happen, and sometimes just imagined. By late February, I had sufficient completed poems to read aloud at open mic events. The first open mic I read was put on by Where I'm Coming From, and it was held at the Cardiff Central Library. The poem I read was An Old Girl Above Cardiff, which had literally been completed earlier that week. Since then, I've read at every Where I'm Coming From, the monthly Lyrical Miracles, and In the Company of Words. All of these are Cardiff open mic sessions. Each morning when I'm not tied to paid work, I sit down for a couple of hours to write new poems, edit previously incomplete poems, or read poetry in every guise. This process of preparing myself for a morning of writing or working on my development as a poet blotting out whatever else is going on in my life or the world at large is not just therapeutic for the soul, but it feels like the vocation I have been forever looking for. The reward is mere words. The reward is a set of completed poems, one after another, and I know that I am just writing poetry for the sake of writing poetry. But that therapeutic healing of the soul can't be overlooked in this. I write because each poem is an endnote, a resolution to a story, real or imagined. Being slightly awkward in social situations and terrible at reading out loud, my poetry is written for the page. When I write, I don't imagine the words to be read aloud, but for someone to read it in a quiet corner of their room in a quiet hour. I write for the page, but as a new poet, the process of reading out one's work is an invaluable exercise, and this is why I pushed myself to read at open mic sessions. From this came the opportunity to visit the Hay Festival 2019, courtesy of Literature Wales, offering the poets from where I'm coming from a day at Hay. I jumped at the chance. I have been to Hay before during off-season many years ago, just to trawl through the bookshops. I think the 2 books I bought during that trip are still on my bookshelf. But this trip was going to be very different. I had started my formal journey into poetry not long ago, so for the opportunity to listen and interact with others from the literary world was just too exciting. Everything about the day, from the coach ride to Hay through spectacular misty caverns, valleys, mountains, to the rain-soaked day and going from tent to tent, at one point braving the rain to head off to St Mary's Church to listen to the magical baritone voice of James Neeby, and then back for the talks. It was all so wonderful. I listened to novelist and professor of creative writing Ruth Gilligan talk about telling stories about other cultures and how to steer clear of cultural appropriation. Professor Martin Jones talking about archaeology of ancient food. Artist Gavin Tuck and rights lawyer Farhana Yamin's experience of protesting at the Extinction Rebellion. And the ladies from Galdem arguing the case for women of colour engaging more. And lastly, the presentation by Literature Wales, where I met the inimitable Cameroonian poet and writer Eric Ngale Charles, whom I've been interacting with on Facebook for quite a while, so it was lovely to meet him. And I also met the chair of the Arts Council Wales, Phil George. Hay was less than a week ago, and I came back home so energised. After a late iftar that evening, I started my YouTube poetry channel, Just Another Poet. It just had to be done. Getting up early in the morning to write poetry, read poems, and reading at open mic is not enough to sustain my poetic journey. And what the trip to Hay Festival has done for me is to home in a realisation that while the process of writing is lonely, there is a wider community of poets and writers out there with their own distinct voices, all with their own stories, and I want to engage in their stories. I want to be Eliot's yellow smoke that rubbed its muzzle on the outside of the window panes, leering at fantastical stories and voices from those shores and beyond. My aim is to develop Just Another Poet as a channel to feature other poets, their works, as well as some of my own, but also chart my journey through poetry. It felt like I came to poetry late, but I hope it's not too late. So thank you again to Della from Literature Wales and the Where I'm Coming From team, as well as the Hay Festival organisers, for instigating and being part of my journey last Wednesday. You all left quite an impression. Thank you.